This is one possible political future for the US that I think might make some things clear, especially to people in the US. There's going to be some concepts and words in it that have strong emotional charges, good and bad for different people, and I'm inviting you to just set those emotions down and listen to the story. All of your emotions and opinions will be waiting for you at the end, but during the story I think they'll just be a distraction, because while the words and concepts are tangentially related, they're not actually the point I'm trying to make, so getting too hung up on any of them will lead you to miss the point. It'll make sense at the end. Similarly, it might be tempting to try and extrapolate my political beliefs from this video, which would be equally as beside the point and probably a misinterpretation or at least a reduction of my actual beliefs. Imagine that the US elected an actual socialist government. Not the corporate socialism of the Democratic Party, where the rich Democrats hand billions in subsidies to their corporate sponsors and billionaires. Actual socialism, where the government simply nationalized companies like Amazon and Walmart, BlackRock and Microsoft, and ran them the same way they do the Postal Service, with high wages, unions, and pensions for all employees. Again, for now, don't get distracted whether you think that's a good or bad idea or why. Just imagine that it's happened. In 2024, the U.S. elected the socialist candidate for president, Claudia de la Cruz, and in 26, her political coattails were large enough to win a majority of seats in Congress for truly socialist candidates. So the entire federal government is now under socialist governance, with sweeping popular support. De la Cruz's government followed the same blueprint that most efforts towards socialism do, so they put a lot of money towards healthcare, education, housing, and infrastructure. College is now totally free. All healthcare is totally free. The cost of housing is 1/4 the mean income, so her government is wildly popular. But it's not all roses, because much of the rest of the global economy is still capitalist, and the capitalists can tell that having the US shift from a capitalist to a socialist economy threatens them. It threatens their price gouging, threatens their debt exploitation, it threatens their chokehold on cheap labor. They're especially worried about a domino effect. If the socialist US looks good and succeeds, Canada and other capitalist countries might fall to this same socialist blight, and the entire global capitalist economy might crumble. Stockbrokers the world over are terrified about next quarter's projections. So the capitalist economies of the world band together to form an alliance that they call CAP to try and shut this down. They place brutal trade embargoes and sanctions on the US and line every coast and border with terrifying weaponry, and their combined might is so great that the US has no hope of breaking it with force. We're now effectively cut off from the rest of the world. But our domestic wealth is actually being redistributed, so for most people, their lives are getting much better. Kids have way better schools. College is free and awesome. There are new hospitals. There's now free public transportation coast to coast. Things are pretty good. The class of the super rich is dissolved to do this. We just take all of Elon Musk and Bill Gates' money and use it to fund hospitals and pay teachers. So there are no billionaires, but there is healthcare, and most people like this. But not everyone. There's absolutely a meaningful block of the population who are super mad. Some of them used to be quite rich, but a lot of them just believe in capitalism, and they're furious that we've adopted socialism on principle, and they have reasons. While healthcare is now totally free, extremely expensive voluntary surgeries are now much less accessible. Private education is no longer an option. It's just well-funded public schools or homeschooling. Taxes are higher, especially on the rich. So some people are really mad. But overall, De la Cruz's government is the most beloved in the history of the country because of the benefits that flowed from it to most people. Most people never had health care, so they don't care that they can't buy $1 million surgery that they couldn't buy before, and things just feel more balanced overall. People of the U.S. who support De la Cruz hope that as our economy proves viable and we prove a stable country under socialism, CAP will allow us to trade globally again, and things will improve even more. But CAP doesn't. Instead, CAP starts funding massive global propaganda campaigns, mostly against De la Cruz. They selectively film the very worst parts of this new socialist U.S. society and blast those clips all over every screen from Chile to Russia and claim that the U.S. is a failed state. They start funding paramilitary groups to infiltrate the U.S. and incite violence, paying for agitators to start political violence in the street for them to film and feed into their propaganda machine. They claim that De la Cruz lost the election. She stole the office she holds. And they show up with a laundry list of receipts that look like evidence that this is true. So the global opinion on the U.S. starts to be that De la Cruz is a dictator who stole the office and rules with an iron fist against the will of the people. Most of the U.S. is outraged about this because, lover or hater, she was democratically elected. So this galvanizes her support because it's seen as evidence that capitalism was always a rigged game, and that De la Cruz is, in fact, standing up to a system of lies and manipulation that was never for our benefit. De la Cruz governs for a little over a decade and then, sadly, passes away of natural causes. She's widely mourned as a liberator and a hero. Before she passes, she gives her support to her VP, Karina Garcia. Garcia runs in the next election, and something interesting happens. Cap has funded a bunch of opposition to Garcia, and despite Garcia winning, Cap contests the election, claims it was rigged. The claim is investigated by the courts, recounts and reviews are done, and it's confirmed that Garcia won, but the opposition funded by Cap never accepts this. They claim it was all illegitimate and insist that Garcia step down for a Cap-funded and approved candidate. Garcia refuses, but this lays the groundwork for a much more aggressive and insidious global propaganda campaign. De la Cruz was super famous, so she was hard to get anything to stick to, but Garcia is much lesser known, so it's easier to paint her as a thief and a dictator, and boy, does Cap lean into that narrative. This work is made easier by the compounding effects of the crippling trade embargoes and sanctions, which are now having a cumulative effect on our domestic economy. Japan, China, and India and others have all dumped their trillions in U.S. debt on the open market for pennies, and Cap has seized all of our national currency overseas. So our currency goes into a tailspin. The cost of goods in the U.S. skyrockets. A loaf of bread is now $50,000. People are literally bringing wheelbarrows of cash to the grocery store. All of a sudden, despite the vast wealth of the U.S., there are bread lines. People can't find work. I bet you can imagine how this would create a severe fracture in the society. A lot of people would demand a return to global trade at any cost. Capitalism would start to look really good in retrospect to a lot of people. When they're paying $80,000 for a sandwich and only getting paid $10 an hour, Cap exploits this to the fullest possible extent, paying more paramilitaries to infiltrate and agitate against Garcia's government, and screaming on every channel that socialism always fails. This is what socialism does. And with that being 100% of the messaging they receive, a lot of people would believe this, both here and abroad. There are riots in the streets, and when Garcia's government deploys police, the footage of any police engagement with the paid agitators and mobs of angry people is plastered all over the world as evidence of Garcia's dictatorial rule. But despite this, a majority of the U.S. still backs Garcia, because they can tell how evil Cap is, and they don't want to go back to watching Elon Musk rip donuts in the sky while none of us can get dental work done or pay our rent. So Garcia retains strong support throughout all of this, which is shocking, because things get really, really bad. It gets to a point where there are lines of hundreds of people with cans anytime a gas station gets a delivery, where medical treatment is very hard to come by. People's needs are really not being met. People are hungry and angry. A lot of people flee, seeking better lives. So under those circumstances, think about what it means for the majority of the population to still support Garcia. It's because they can see who their enemy is, and it's not Garcia. It's Cap and the brutal trade embargoes and sanctions which are preventing us from functioning as part of the global economy. So people are willing to suffer for the sake of maintaining this momentum towards a better world. And the suffering is not actually how Cap portrays it. Community gardens spring up everywhere. Neighborhoods start organizing daily cookouts for anyone who needs food. And everyone brings what they have to share meals with music and songs. So despite Cap's propaganda, a lot of people actually prefer this to the hyper-individual, isolated one that they left behind. But not everyone. A lot of people are still super mad that we went socialist at all, and they're in the streets, fueled by the Cap-funded agitators. And they have some valid critiques of Garcia. There are some valid questions about where some of that money is going, how things are being run. Some people think she's appointing her friends, taking money under the table. But if you ask most of the people in the country who loved De La Cruz and support Garcia, they'll just laugh at you and say, compared to what? How it was run under Biden and Trump, they just stole all our money and gave it to like 5 ultra-rich psychopaths, and we couldn't afford anything then either. So sure, Garcia's government's far from perfect, but we'll take it over capitalism any day of the week. At least we can go to the hospital when we're sick now, even if the hospital's poor. And our taxes aren't funding atrocities and human rights violations all over the world. So it starts to look like people will put up with a lot of scarcity for the sake of a more equitable and better world. So this is the scene when it's time for another election. And in this election, Cap pushes in a candidate who is a very stable, older man with a kind face who's been a Cap agent his entire life. He supports literally all of the worst things in the entire world for the sake of Cap, with a tone of, "Grandpa knows best, you silly children," which people who see his policies experience as unbelievably patronizing. So we'll call him Grandpa. Garcia wins this election by a large margin, but Grandpa also immediately claims victory, and Cap begins flooding their entire world with propaganda, headline after headline, that Garcia's stealing another election, claiming that all the exit polls show Grandpa winning by a truly unbelievable margin. But here's the thing. All their evidence is from one international polling agency, which Cap owns. Literally, on the website of this polling agency, it says that their whole mission is to advance the goals of Cap. So if you ask Garcia's supporters, they'll likely just laugh and say, that's not a polling agency at all. That's just more Cap propaganda, and not even very good propaganda at that. They stand with Garcia. In their opinion, she represents by far their best chance for a better world and a better USA, despite all the crap that CAP is pulling and despite how people have had to really tighten their belts and suffer losses. And it's noteworthy that at this point, even with the decades of embargoes and sanctions, our economy's begun to stabilize. People can get jobs again, and there are still breadlines, but they're nowhere near as long as they were. It seems like we can weather CAP's nonsense and rebuild an independent, internal socialist economy, even without that much global trade. Many people think this is why CAP is pulling this even more overt nonsense with Grandpa. In this hypothetical, who would you support? It's likely that if Grandpa got into office, things in the very short term would improve, but it would guarantee the return of Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. Would that seem worth it? Could you understand why there are people on both sides of that? Could you understand how a bunch of people who hated the idea of socialism to begin with might absolutely want Grandpa? Could you understand why the people who support Garcia think that those folks have been propagandized into supporting a system that was always designed to exploit them and continue working as hard as they can to fight for Garcia for the sake of a more equitable and better world, not just for them, but for their grandkids? This story is not just a mixed fiction about a possible future for the US. As a handful of you already know, this is the history of Venezuela. Hugo Chavez was Claudia de la Cruz in the story, and Nicolas Maduro is Corina Garcia. Until very recently, I thought Maduro was just a dictator who stole the country on the heels of Chavez and was running it into ruin because of the propaganda surrounding Venezuela, which is very, very hard to see through. And I'm not saying Maduro's a good guy. I don't know. He's almost certainly a mixed person and a mixed politician. In fact, I'm not saying I know anything at all about Venezuelan politics. The point of this entire video is that I don't. From where I sit, in the heart of CAP, it's almost impossible to see through the wall of continuous propaganda around that country. Especially if you live in the US, your perspective on Venezuelan politics is equally as skewed. That's the point of this video. Regardless of what you think of capitalism or socialism, your thinking has been intentionally shaped your entire life by CAP's propaganda, and it's worth checking whether that propaganda is true, the whole story, and whether you might actually agree with people you've been taught to hate. My wife is Venezuelan. They lived there as a kid, so we have a bunch of family there, and Venezuelan political beliefs are complicated. Just imagine, we're talking about the Caribbean, where Columbus landed. He came to right outside Caracas on his third trip. It was my wife's ancestors who lived through the unspeakable horrors he committed. That land has been under colonial rule for a long, long time, and neither Simón Bolívar nor Hugo Chavez magically undid all of that trauma. There's many centuries of capitalist colonial violence and systems to address, and that takes time, which is made much harder by the embargoes and sanctions the US puts on them. So we have family who supported Chavez and now support Maduro. We have family who are tired and apolitical. We have family who support US-aligned candidates like Guaido and González, Grandpa. A lot of the people who support Guaido and González idealize the US and think that these US-aligned candidates will make Venezuela more like the US. Many of them dream of getting to the US. Both those narratives, that the US is a holy land to dream of getting to, and that if you support US-allied politicians, then your country can be just like the US, are sold hard in propaganda to Venezuelans and everyone else who lives in countries which the US exploits. Our family who migrated or fled to the US, they mostly support González and Trump. Our family who still live in Venezuela overwhelmingly support Maduro. This is pretty typical. The people who want to stay in Venezuela and don't dream of leaving for the US overwhelmingly support Maduro. Those are broad brushstrokes. There are tons of exceptions, but the trends are illustrative. It's only through years of conversations with all these people in my family that I have this perspective to share at all. The people on the streets in Caracas are like, nah, these riots you see are often a bunch of Colombian paramilitaries who have been paid by the US to come here and start violence for the cameras. They're not even Venezuelans. It's the equivalent of being in that hypothetical future where the US is socialist at a MAGA march against socialism and seeing a bunch of dudes with military gear being like, let's throw some Molotovs, eh? You'd be like, what is happening? Unless you knew what was happening, and then you'd be like, this is messed up. This is not actually what the people of my country want. This is 100% cap. This is why Maduro's supporters are showing up to oppose the violence in the streets, and you'll see them siding with the police. That's very hard to wrap our head around from here in the US, especially for the left, where police violence is virtually always oppression. In countries whose politics are not always as staunchly committed to oppression as ours is, it's not always that simple. So the left is likely to side with the cops in Venezuela today against the paramilitary agitators inciting violence for global propaganda. This really makes us ask, who are the people? Everybody wants to claim they represent the people, but the people are not a monolith, and everyone thinks they're speaking for the collective and for the collective good. Like, was January 6th the people? This is why people practice elections, to try and get past that collective claiming rhetoric. In the US, we can see this pretty clearly because we live here, but because of racism, it's hard for us to see this complexity when we're looking at a brown country. There's a strong tendency, especially on the left, to reduce the entire body politic down to one belief. There's a weird leftist racist narrative in the US that goes something like, all brown people are poor and oppressed, and therefore they are all fighting for liberation, so if they're fighting Maduro, he must be the oppressor. This is a racist reduction of a complex body politic down to a convenient monolith for the leftist white gaze, which actually erases the very real and meaningful liberation work that's been done in Venezuela already and reinforces the US's duplicitous narrative that Maduro is just a dictator. There are poor people fighting for capitalism in Venezuela just like there are poor people fighting for Trump here. It's just not a majority. None of this is binary. The police in Venezuela are incredibly corrupt, problematic, and violent. They're not the good guys in this story who need to be excused and venerated. That's not the takeaway. The point is that it's not black and white, and it's not the US. It's through my family in Venezuela and Venezuelan community that I have some idea what the factions and beliefs are there, and that I know things are getting better. So the election that just happened, Maduro won. For the reasons in this video, I was skeptical because I was seeing a bunch of exit polling saying Gonzalez won by a huge margin, until I saw independent reporters sharing about how the polling agency reporting that, which all the news outlets are dutifully regurgitating, is owned and run by the US, and its entire stated mission is to advance US interests. People actually really like Maduro, and they would rather tighten their belts than return to US imperial rule. There are 195 countries in the world. The US has invaded or maintained military presences in 192 of them. That's not defense. Were we at military risk from Nicaragua, Congo, Vietnam? No. So why did the US invade Vietnam? Well, Vietnam implemented socialist policies that the US was terrified would have a domino effect in the region, which would threaten their ability to economically exploit the Pacific Rim for cheap labor. So rather than allow Vietnam democracy and socialism, the US turned it into smoldering rubble at the cost of 2.5 million lives. That was the entire point of that war. This is why the US overthrew Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president of Chile, and instituted Augusto Pinochet, a brutal dictator who committed unspeakable crimes against humanity, but was happy to open Chile to US economic exploitation. The list of examples of this pattern is basically endless. Guatemala, Iran, Congo, Hawaii, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Iraq. Scratch the surface of any of that propaganda even a little, and it's impossible not to conclude that all of these wars were just the US crushing democratic governments which threatened US hegemony. I remember in junior high asking why we went to war in Vietnam and feeling really confused because the teacher's response was just kind of a bunch of meaningless word salad that reduced down to some US imperialist buzzwords. There was no reason. Because they probably didn't know, and you're not actually supposed to say any of this out loud. But just like Cap in the story is not just one country, this pattern extends far beyond the US. Catalonia was a truly free democratic country in Europe, but as soon as it claimed its independence, the monarchies of Europe set aside their petty differences and joined forces to crush it back into compliance with capitalist exploitation. Maduro was one of the first global leaders to openly support watermelon, both with his words and direct action. The US's pawn, who they're claiming won the election, Edmundo Gonzalez, Grandpa, is a staunch, lifelong supporter of the blue and white. Again, I'm not saying Maduro is good, and I'm certainly not saying I know what's best for the people or land of Venezuela. My point is just that Maduro is not who I was taught he was, and Venezuelan politics are not at all what they look like through the lens of the US and most global media. Even media outlets who are usually pretty good, like Al Jazeera, are currently regurgitating the US's imperialist nonsense right now. The news groups covering this accurately are tiny and independent, like BT Newsroom. If your perspective on Venezuela is just from US and US-aligned sources, it's simply wrong, even if it's leftist. It's worth reading books like The Open Veins of Latin America and listening to diverse people on the ground, especially those who support Maduro, to get a more grounded perspective. If I had not read Chomsky to understand propaganda systems and also didn't have close family on the ground in Caracas, I would understand none of this, especially what these things mean together, the way that I'm trying to express in this video. I hope that through this story and metaphor we can better understand why most of the people of Venezuela don't particularly care about the critiques of Maduro, even if some of them are true. From their perspective, even if he's kind of a terrible person, he and his party in the lineage of Chavez still represent the best possible hope for their future of the country and the world, because he's the political leader actively resisting the boot that is on their throats and the throats of poor people around the world. And I hope we can see how the propaganda system of Western capitalism would be insane not to try and appropriate and co-opt that well-intentioned, passionate spirit of self-sacrifice and redirect it back into support for the empire. Because it is this exact same spirit of resistance to oppressive empire that drives the support for Trump here in the US today. Trump paints himself as liberatory and anti-empire. So the people who believe him and support him simply don't care about his personal shortcomings for the exact same reason that Venezuelans don't care about Maduro's shortcomings. The fact that Maduro is actually opposing the oppressive empire that's crushing us all, while Trump is the very heart of its embodiment, doesn't change that tone of revolutionary dismissal of their personal shortcomings at all. This is nothing new. The far right always co-opts the anger and passion that people feel against the systems that are oppressing them to redirect it back into those systems. This is why the Nazis called themselves socialists. They weren't, not even a little. Words have meaning, and socialism means social ownership of the means of production and collective accountability. The Nazis were fascists, which is a system of centralized authority and a complete lack of accountability for leadership. The fact that they dissolve the distinctions between private and public sectors doesn't make them socialists any more than using liquid currency, money, makes a group of people capitalists. So the Nazis calling themselves socialists was propaganda intended to co-opt the very legitimate anger that people felt and the trend towards socialism at the time, and redirect that energy into an even more authoritarian centralization of control, which is exactly what Trump is doing when he paints himself as a revolutionary who's working for the people while handing blank checks to all his billionaire buddies and filling his cabinet with the very worst scum of corporate boardrooms. It's a complete inversion of reality in the exact same way that the propaganda machine paints Maduro as stealing the election as a way to try and steal the election. Gonzalez, who's currently trying to steal the election, he's pitching a return to stability and the rule of law while trying to illegally steal the election and destabilize the entire region for the sake of U.S. markets being able to exploit Venezuelan oil reserves and labor. The propaganda makes everything the exact opposite of what it is. So Venezuela is at grave risk, but it's not from socialism. The risk to Venezuela is the ongoing humanitarian crisis which is being directly caused by U.S. blockades, embargoes, and sanctions, and the possibility that the U.S. might decide to bring some of that same American freedom there that the U.S. military has brought to so many other lucky nations around the globe. Venezuela is at risk for the same reason Vietnam was at risk when they refused to bend the knee to the U.S. empire, and the U.S. has been setting up propaganda for decades to validate an invasion. The rhetoric would be, there's been decades of stolen elections and dictators in Venezuela, so the U.S. needs to invade and restore the rule of law and true democracy for the people of Venezuela and the stability of the region. And then they would destabilize the region, overthrow the rule of law, and install yet another brutal dictator who they would claim was democratically elected in order to exploit Venezuelan oil and people again. Again, the point here is not actually opposition or support for socialism or capitalism. Despite what you may think from this video, I'm not a socialist, and I'm obviously not a capitalist. You want to know my political beliefs? Go listen to Oren Lyons, faithkeeper of the Wolf Clan, of the Seneca of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy kept an ecologically stable, egalitarian, multinational peace for 2 millennia in what's now the US and Canada, while white people were dying of plagues because we lived in our own feces and developing ever more horrifying ways to hurt one another. So I am far more interested in the millennia-proven, ecologically stable indigenous governance and leadership methodologies than I am in any Western system of governance, including socialism. Call me crazy, but I'm just more interested in the governance models of the people whose land was a paradise on earth and who never had to flee or colonize other people's land. So this video is not so much pro-socialism as it is just trying to illuminate the propaganda and illustrate that neither I nor you are immune to it. My concept of Venezuela was wrong a decade ago. It was wrong 2 years ago. It was wrong 2 days ago. It's wrong today. Count on the narrative of this video being incomplete at best and probably mistaken in some ways. I do. That's my point. Even talking with my family in Caracas, I don't have the whole story. But Venezuela will be the ancestral homeland of my children, along with Cornwall, and I care about it deeply. So I'm paying attention, listening and learning as best I can, and I very much look forward to visiting that beautiful and holy place that created the person I love most in the world today, hopefully as it becomes ever healthier and more free. May we all see with ever clearer eyes.